はありません。怪盗団の動き、どう見ますか？
単純になすすべがないのでは。これまでの相手とは明らかに毛色が違いますから、無用な被害が出る前に早く素性を明かすべきですね。
With Kanashiro's arrest, Sai's workload is slightly lightened, though it's to her own irritation as she'd spent years trying to build a case against him, only for the police she was working with to be absolutely no help to her. So for these Phantom Thieves to, from her perspective, convince him to turn himself in a day, that's infuriating. And to reiterate from last time, this acts as further evidence for the speculation that Kanashiro was involved in their dad's death, as why else would Sai have spent years trying to build a case against a man who'd become invisible or even protected by the cops, and was helping bankroll her bosses? They would have shut down her case, or if they knew of it, given it to a more senior prosecutor to look over. Hell, it makes more sense why no one she regularly worked with would be assisting in uncovering their activities if they themselves were involved in his immunity. Now, she frames it as the Kanashiro case would have lined her up for a promotion, but that seems exceedingly nepotistic, especially because her bosses demand a 99% conviction rate from her in order for her to keep her job. So the fact she was being denied any assistance in actually building a case to begin with? No, that's Sai deflecting what actually made her mad about the whole situation, in that she wanted to be the one that brought him down, and the deflection is to disguise the envy she feels at what she ultimately failed to do. A completely logical place to be in if Kanashiro had been involved in killing their father. As such a crime lord being a cop killer, oh, that does change everything. But again, speculation. No official media has confirmed any of that. It's all just subtext making better sense of everything already provided, which, in my opinion, makes the story better. Plus, it would also explain one other thing that occurs here. But we are not ready to discuss that yet, so we shall be tabling it for now.
大衆の怪盗団への支持は感心しませんな。怪盗団の足取りに注目されて、例の世界が明るみに出る危険もありますし、実は彼の持ち込みで一つ使えそうな策がありましてね。直接対峙することなく怪盗団には自滅してもらうというものでして、廃人化の件を怪盗団の仕業に仕立て上げてやるんですよ。やはりそうでしたか。奴のアイデアにしては容赦がないなと。それにしても先生、これほど入念な策で潰しにかかるとは。
However, with all the time the group has taken to uncover and defeat Kanashiro, the Phantom Thieves have all forgotten something. It's nearing the end of the first term of the school year, which in Japan runs from April through March in a 3-term structure, meaning they have exams coming up before they're let out of classes for the summer. Fortunately for the dumb ones in this group, not only is Ren a good student, in this lap at least, but Makoto is scholastically the top of the school, and she owes them as well for her selfish requests, this getting her to act as the tutor for the three having problems, leading to the exams going how one expects for a scripted event. The only thing that could possibly hope to save them is an unrealistic dose of luck, or rather, some fortune falling their way.
我は汝、汝は我。汝、ここに新たなるちぎりを得たり。ちぎりはすなわち、囚われを破らんとする反逆の翼なり。我、運命のペルソナの生誕に祝福の風を得たり。自由へと至るさらなる力とならん。
I tell a bit of a lie with that. Chihaya Mifune bears no standing on whether An and Ryuji actually pass or fail their classes. That's gonna be on them. I just found that a good segue into discussing her confidant here. as hers is another secondary confidant that acts as being pretty important in the grand scheme of accelerating progression in the game. Though coincidentally, I swear Chihaya's design is deliberately based on the witch from the 3rd episode of Lupin the Third Part 1. In Japanese, her role was originally portrayed by Miyu Matsuki, who recorded her lines for the game in the middle of 2015, just to show how long Persona 5 was in development before it released in early 2017 internationally, though admittedly the game first went on sale in Japan in late 2016. And we have that timeline for the game's development thanks to her as well, with the story being completed by the end of 2014, before the game's actual assets were constructed, as she needed to have recorded those lines that far in advance because Miyu Matsuki died in October of 2015 from lymphoma, over a year before the game actually released. In the animation and Royal, Chihaya was recast with Haruka Terui taking over the role. Haruka, more known as Yuki Yuna from Yuki Yuna as a Hero, as well as Shania from Xenoblade Chronicles 3, which is also the role subversion, as Chihaya falls into the trap of accepting the fate presented to her, while the normal characters Haruka portrays are ones that tend to punch fate in the face. We first encounter her amid the Kaneshiro storyline when we gain access to Shinjuku, her being a fortune teller with her own tiny setup table, but from observation of her she seems to actually be able to predict the path of people's lives.
出ました。マジかよ。
See? That is spooky. Unfortunately, despite the genuineness of Chihaya's abilities to divine fate, she is unfortunately naive, having fallen into the hands of a group of scam artists trying to use her to sell magic rocks, by proxy of her abilities making people have faith in the worthless trinkets to improve their circumstances over actually doing anything to improve their lot in life. The con artists are running a cult for the sole purpose of looting all the wealth they can from their marks, and in this case, leave the innocent Chihaya holding the bag because their marks are made to believe in her and her divining of fate. And this is again where some of the overt politics of the game are being made visible, but this is something that doesn't connect as such to foreigners, as Japan has a lot of cults. Like, a lot of cults. I do not underscore that. As of a report in 2022, there are over 2,000 organized groups classifiable as cults in the country, representing 10 to 20% of their population. And the grand majority of them are scams designed for the people that run them to loot people of their personal wealth while selling themselves as legitimate organizations. Other countries have this same problem too, varying extents, but rarely are they allowed to name themselves as organized religions. Worse, because of many of these cults gaining the capital to influence and finance politicians, the government has been very anemic with regards to any attempts to curb their malice. This in part facilitated by former Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, as he was actually helped into office originally by several of these organizations in private funding him, which, when his connections were made more public, led to a man whose family was ruined by them to kill him in broad daylight as he had nothing left to lose. Do not get attached to cults. That's all I can say on the matter. And it's not like that man who killed Abe was the only victim acting out. Not all of these cults are so overt as to, say, be responsible for known terrorist incidents, such as the Aum Shinrikyo cults that in 1995 were responsible for attacking the Tokyo subway network with sarin gas, or facilitated other known criminal activity beyond just swindling their members' money. A lot of them these days, thanks to the effectiveness of Shinzo Abe in facilitating their interests, spend their time funneling money into political operations to maintain their scam, them donating heavily to the conservative-controlled legislature, and that does a lot to maintain their power. So actually getting legislation on the floor to abolish these abuses is just not happening. Not helped by the cult members endorsing their mandates because they've been manipulated into believing subjective opinions as objective truths, and Japan's traditionalist values of ritual patterns, conformity, emotional isolation, and cognitive dissonance to always benefit a group over oneself, alongside the normalization of extremist expectations as just part of normal woke culture. Yeah, all of that is a breeding ground for suckering one into a cult, as they offer an alternative that puts one's mind at ease regarding their standing in the world, when an individual inevitably is burned out from all of that. In Persona 5, all of these socio-cultural problems are also what the palaces take advantage of to indoctrinate those trapped by their influence. And thus Chihiya's story shows that what keeps being done to people due to supernatural causes can as much have a mundane source where someone is suckered into acting against their own best interests in exchange for just a little bit of comfort, never realizing the costs such comforts come at. This is something that can affect anyone and everyone. It's not just things that require a grand massive cult either, just enough veneer of legitimacy for them to steal from you. And it's not a weakness to realize you were fooled by them, as you are the victim. But there reaches a point where someone stops being a victim and then acts as an enabler. And that happens when they know what these con artists and cults truly are, and yet don't care, so continue their support, because it gives them some advantage over others, or moves forward their own agenda, even if they know their abusers don't give a damn about them. For at that point, they have become part of the problem, and that is when you can't help them anymore. Fortunately, Chihiya is nowhere near that point. She knows what the scammers are doing is wrong, but she's in a bad position herself and is being taken advantage of because she's a girl from a remote mountain village used to just obeying without thought that's now living in a big city, and she is one of the easiest marks these monsters could make. Chihiya in the past made to believe that the fate she sees cannot be changed, that including her own, because every time she sees someone's future and tells them, they keep acting in ways that make such warnings into self-fulfilling prophecies they then come to blame her for. Example in why she left her mountain village being with how people got fed up with her predicting disasters that saved their lives, to just show how ungrateful they were. And to begin her confidant bond, we have to intercede on another such case, getting the name of an abusive boyfriend of one of Chihiya's regulars, who refuses to listen to her warnings and change his heart. Over time, I came to view the problem Chihiya has to do with how she's terrible at persuading people to make informed decisions. I feel it's a consequence of her power, though while she can see a probable future, it prevents her from considering possible ways to avert them, and not helped by her upbringing, which has made her defer to people who seem to know better, but actually don't. But because of Ren's power of rebellion allowing him the capacity to sever the chains of fate, Chihiya becomes more open to the possibility that fate can be changed if someone is educated on the right step to take, or getting help in doing what one cannot do alone. But that's what starts to aggravate Chihiya's handlers, as a defined fate for a person is predictable, and con artists can milk that by selling them solutions, just not the ones they need. But once they begin to resolve them on their own, the con men lose that leverage, and thus expose how malicious they are. Such being the case with Chihiya's benefactor, as even as we begin to wake her up to new possibilities, the chairman of the cult that's using her, Fukurai, is exploiting her as a means to sell their worthless trinkets and luck charms at a premium, to act as wards to bad fates and indoctrinate them to their causes as an endless money machine. And if she doesn't, she'll just make her pay instead, thus entrapping her to be damned if she does and damned if she doesn't. But that doesn't happen because Ren woke her up to the means by which futures can be changed, by fighting for the ones you want to have, no matter the adversity. She begins to investigate Fukurai's organization herself, only for what she uncovers to scare her as they're actually drugging people into hypnotic states to rob them, leading her to request we change his hearts. And from doing so we learn that Fukurai was himself abused in the same way he has Chihiya, scammed from the moment he moved into the city from a small village, and ever since he's never stopped trying to get even, by passing on down the same sin he was victim to. Once again, you stop being a victim and instead act as an enabler to a malicious system the second you begin to actively support a cycle of abuse. His origin does not justify his actions, just make them all the more evil. But with his heart changed, Chihaya is free, and with her eyes opened and a bit more spine behind her, she can be allowed to continue doing her part in warning people of mistakes they may make to possibly work towards their own best destiny. Which is where Chihaya's role as a confidant comes in, as she is the game's own built-in cheat code. By ranking up her confidant, you get advancement bonuses to Ren's social stats, money gain, and even progression with the other confidants. If you've not spent enough time interacting with a cast member by which to flag their next rank up, then buying a fortune from Chihaya can permit you bonus affection with them, enough to be able to skip the affection event and reach the next rank up. This becomes outright required late in the game with the characters you have the least amount of time with in order to complete their blood oaths and confirm they will not betray you, all in order to avoid the worst ending. Hell, achieving a blood oath with her lets you see the options in the dialogue system that allow you affection bonuses from cast member interactions. Though these days those can be found in play guides, but the thought does count. In this respect, Chihaya becomes representative of the Shirley finette of this game, despite bearing few commonalities with the character beyond her general naivete, and admittedly some of those signs also being seen of Sumi in the royal content. But by thematic and story role, well again, Shirley was a character whose fate became save the cheerleader, save the world, as their death defined the breaking of Lelouch's resolve that led to his own self-destructive suicide spiral. But defiance of that fate as exemplared in Super Robot Wars Z permitted happier possibilities to be showcased. For by showing Chihaya fate can be changed, and helping her avoid her black fate, does she allow Ren's own to be altered through granting him the time to do it. Though for similar reasons to Shirley, Chihaya as a paramour doesn't really click with me, as despite her experiences, she still comes off as someone that can't really handle the life Ren lives as a phantom thief, so is just better off being a friend.
化け物とか巫女とかもう揺らいだりしません。私は単なる占い師。心が弱ってる方々にアドバイスするんです。運命に流されず信念を持って新しい未来を切り開けるように。それが私が決めた私の運命です。次はあなたが喋る番ですよ。あなたの信念。いえ、怪盗の信念は何なんでしょう。大丈夫？誰にも言いませんよ。でもいいんです。あなたの正体が何であっても、これからもあなたがいてくれれば、私は私自身であり続けられると思うんです。だからいいんです。我は汝、汝は我。汝ここにちぎりを血明の絆へと転生せしめたり。絆は反逆の翼となりて魂のくびきを打ち破らん。今こそ汝、運命の究極なる非王に目覚めたり。無尽の力を汝に与えん。ただ怪盗団の運命がなんだか怪しいんですよ。アルカナが微妙な配置。行き先は天国とも地獄とも取れるような。
So yeah, as Chihaya is at the point of these exams, all she would have been able to tell Ryuji and An would be that they were completely screwed, which would have done nothing but demoralize them from studying by which to potentially change that. But thanks to there being two geniuses in the group, they at least have a chance. With Sojiro being called away from the coffee shop on an errand for his adopted daughter, and the focus of the next arc of the game. The Palace Victim and Hikkomori Futaba Sakura, a younger girl who has retreated from the world following the death of her mother 2 years before the events of the game even began. And assuming we have the timeline of events correct, it's very likely Wakaba was the first victim of the conspiracy to be killed through the metaverse. At least of the ones we know about. For after the team's exams are over and the group are let out of classes for summer break, and subsequently they try and go to see the summer fireworks, only for that to be ruined by a storm, causing them to bravely cross paths with Haru, who is being watched over by a large swath of guards. More relevant for later than here to show how much of a cage she's being trapped in, Ren and company return to Cafe LeBlanc to find Sai harassing Sojiro and threatening to extort him to get what she wants out of him. Not like that! Though what she's after does pertain to Futaba, and the greater case Sai is working around the psychotic breakdowns and mental shutdowns. For Futaba's mother, Wakaba Ishiki, was a researcher into cognitive science.
認知科学な。科学の科じゃないぞ。摩訶不思議の科な。そこ大事。
Such is a fake science discipline focused around psychic phenomena that affect perception and cognition. Or, in other terms, Wakaba was researching the metaverse, manifestations of shadows, and how their manipulation can impact a real person. One wonders how she would have done this without, say, a test subject able to interact with the metaverse to begin with. But considering organizations like the Nanjo and Kirijo groups introduced in the earlier Persona games know of and likewise studied shadows themselves, then an independent researcher doing the same is not so far-fetched in the grand scheme of this setting. However, all of her research went missing immediately after she died, and that is what Sai is after, as she believes that may be key in cracking the case regarding the breakdowns. And she thinks Sojiro has it, so is threatening him with the loss of custody of Futaba, and for that matter Ren as well, as being deemed unsuitable for one will invalidate the other, that all being why Sojiro has acted as a no-nonsense guardian for Ren. He refuses to put Futaba at risk, as she's all he has left of the woman he loved. Now, because the last several videos of this review series have gone so long, I'm summarizing more of this down than I probably should. But the bottom line of this is that despite Sojiro's affections for Wakaba, it was never mutual. Him accepting she would only ever see him as her closest friend. Whoever Wakaba actually conceived Futaba with is never stated, and she raised her daughter alone, albeit with a bit of help from Sojiro along the way. But following the circumstances of Wakaba's death, Futaba was berated, beaten, and starved by her actual relatives that led to her retreating from the world, throwing up psychological blockades to everyone and everything around herself, ones not even Sojiro has been able to heal. But despite the evidence of abuse piling up, Sojiro was only able to get custody awarded to himself after he exhausted all of his finances just to pay off Futaba's relatives. He loved Wakaba that much, and cares about Futaba so deeply even though he's not her biological father, that no matter the personal cost, he refuses to abandon her. But it may not be up to him much longer, as Futaba isn't getting better, and her palace has only gotten worse, to the point she's outright hallucinating. Though this also begs the question of whether these are actually hallucinations to begin with, or her palace has gained that much power that it is beginning to distort reality around her. Thus what Sai is threatening Sojiro with is sicking Japan's child welfare service on him, which would lead them to remove her from his care due to the deterioration of Futaba's mental state, if he does not give Sai what she wants. And the child welfare service is not considered a laughing matter in Japan. Hell, they've actually gotten more strict and aggressive past the release of the original Persona 5, following an event in 2018 where a 5-year-old girl died from neglect and malnutrition after her parents were already under watch from the department and had their child removed from their home multiple times before. But the caseworkers didn't push aggressively enough due to their workloads to advocate for the child's permanent relocation. And to go back to what we discussed in part 2 of these videos of victims in Japan needing to make a statement for their abusers to be charged, yeah, the little girl had been begging the authorities to not send her back to her parents. But the entire department had just become so overwhelmed dealing with hundreds of thousands of cases of child abuse at the time, an excessive increase in their workload the department had never been designed to manage, that this one girl fell through the cracks, if not more, that weren't reported on. It was such an oversighted failure of the system that, thanks to the birth rate declines of the country already, there was nonpartisan agreement that rushed through legislation to increase the legal powers of the department as well as doubling their workforce to prevent further incidents from occurring. I can't say to the context of whether any more have failed, but there was at least a concerted effort to actually prevent more of them. And with that context, it just continues to show how on point the socio-cultural political commentary actually is with this game. As with the department's overworked workload at the time, as this was said in 2016, once more, do you think they'd actually bother to investigate when it's a prosecutor asking them to look into this? No, Futaba would be taken, and he'd never get her back before Futaba would kill herself. But Sotaro can't give in to Sai's demands, because he doesn't have Wakaba's research. Who does? Who do you think at this point? Members of the conspiracy stole it after orchestrating Wakaba's murder. Thus, what Sai wants, her bosses already have, and have been using to facilitate their schemes. Hell, for all we know, Wakaba's research might have led them to learning how to use cognitive and psychological distortions to create palaces to begin with.
あなたが追う事件と怪盗の行為、重なる部分はありませんか？根拠は？すべての事件に共通する当事者の不可解な心変わりです。それは私も睨んでる。だけど根拠じゃないでしょ。愛人家の被害者の娘を引き取ったという男から有益な情報は得られたんですか？さっぱりよ。そうですか。では僕は勝利のために何をしましょう？怪盗団、徹底的によろしく。勝つためなら手段は問わない。それが私の流儀だから。
For as we learn over the course of the arc, well, I've already said it, Futaba is herself a palace ruler. But unlike the other ones, the perception filter effect is being used against its own ruler. It is what made it so Child Welfare Services overlooked her family's abuse of her and normalized her damaged psychological state as something she herself was to blame for, all being framed as the consequence of Wakaba's death, as at Wakaba's funeral a government official walked in and read aloud a suicide note, one that indicted Futaba for Wakaba's decision to destroy her research and throw herself into traffic, when she was out with Futaba, who had a front row seat to her dying. This in turn broke Futaba and caused her palace to form, and the palace itself is preventing her trauma from healing, actually making it worse and worse over time as she's forced by the palace to relive it, because the sin Futaba's palace formed around was wrath, the palace itself acting to bury her under the weight of guilt, hate, and self-loathing she'd made to inflict on herself and can never escape, because she is not allowed to ever leave that moment. This entire scenario to me acted as just more evidence of the palaces not being naturally occurring, but artificially created, as, due to the terms under which they form, why would someone turn a sin such as wrath on themselves, as opposed to lashing out more and more aggressively to those who wrongfully accused and harmed her, as there is such a thing as retaliation in excess, which, under normal circumstances, would be wrath's wheelhouse, if it were not for wrath like is depicted here, not being something that is covered by self-loathing, as in that alignment of deadly sins, self-loathing is covered under sloth and despair, not wrath. Thus, she is not inflicting this upon herself. But when you put it in the terms of this was done to her, as part of the cover-up of her mother's murder, and thus creating means by which to once again shift the blame and distract from the circumstances, it makes a lot more sense. As over the course of saving Futaba from the palace, we do learn that Wakaba had completed her research and was about to spend time with her daughter that she hadn't been to in the midst of her work, which refutes outright what the forged suicide note says. Though again, because of the timing of Wakaba's death, this was before anyone outside of the conspiracy would have known what a mental shutdown was for it to even be seen as part of a pattern. Hell, there would have been no reason for them to even go back and retroactively consider it as a mental shutdown. This is even further presented by how Futaba's shadow itself is not distorted nor gaining power and influence from the palace. It's actually attempting to rebel against the distortion. But its grip on Futaba's psyche is so strong, the real Futaba can't shake it off. If this was supposed to be naturally occurring, then the shadow would be torturing their true self, and not need another existence in the palace to torment her. But such a distortion being an invader externally triggered and injected, and Futaba knowing so strongly she wasn't to blame to psychologically resist the influence even when she was emotionally devastated, yeah, no, the palace is there to destroy the first and last person that would in any way seek to uncover the truth of the conspiracy's actions. And the stronger her palace grows over time, the more it tortures her, making her think she deserves it. And while the conspiracy couldn't have known that Futaba is in fact a skilled hacker to even consider her a risk to them, her possibility even developing that skill set from the start in an attempt to find out the truth of what happened to her mom, the possibility that someone would listen and investigate, is something they needed to prevent to start with. And thus, that's why Futaba once more fits the pattern of the palace rulers all being those impacted by the conspiracy's actions. And they've already nearly succeeded in that goal of silencing her. She's at a critical inflection point where her own neuroses have driven her into her own tomb, preventing her from being able to ask others for help for her own sake, as she doesn't feel she deserves it anymore, requiring her to set up her own forms of surveillance when she can sneak around unnoticed, and she has done so to Café LeBlanc, allowing her to learn of the Phantom Thieves due to her monitoring of Ren's activities. Not like that! At least as of yet. I mean, if you consider her a Paramore option later, she could probably spy like that, but that's a bit creepy, even for her. But also why she only contacts them now for help is she was watching when Sojiro had his confrontation with Sai to know that were she taken, it would utterly destroy Sojiro. And regardless of what the distortion is making her think of herself and its role in driving herself to her own death, she can't do that to him. It's why she's held on for as long as she has. For while they are not related by blood, he is her father in every way that matters. Thus, the only option. Hack the phones of the Phantom Thieves, play act as a villain threatening to expose them, and get them to change her heart. Done that way, simply because she doesn't feel like she deserves the kindness of receiving help by even asking for it. Now, this next part of the story is something that confuses several people due to the way it is presented, resulting in players getting the wrong idea, and not helped once again by the localization. And those events are the conspiracy, through one of their members being the head of an intelligence technology company, uses the alias of Medjed to publicly challenge the Phantom Thieves, trying to get them to work for them in the name of justice, or so destroy their reputation that they won't be a threat anymore as, of course, an anonymous hacker. They're not going to be able to do anything to change his heart, as the one performing the task really doesn't have a source of distortion. Why this confuses people, however, is Futaba is also Medjed, but not the Medjed that is calling them out. There are two different hackers trying to get the thieves' attention with connections to the name, as Medjed is a hacker collective alias not belonging to any one person. Or at least it doesn't anymore. Futaba was the original Medjed and operated for a time as a white hat hacker. Basically an activist bringing to light crimes and corruption, but she abandoned that identity as her palace-caused psychoses became worse, leading to others taking it up. Medjed under Futaba was originally intended to be similar to the hacker activist group Anonymous, the group even using similar catchphrases. But much like with Anonymous, for when it has been co-opted for openly criminal acts and not just to expose the corrupt, a group operating under an alias can have their intentions completely waylaid by a single malicious man taking to defaming that name, and you can't tell who was using it for any given incident they're involved in.
じゃあ君たちはメジエドに狙われていた間、全く別人を相手にしていたの？ならどうしてメジエドを？でも、桜家の事情の話は検察の調べとおおむね一致してる。
Futaba instead contacts the thieves through the alias of Alibaba, from the folktale Alibaba and the 40 Thieves, which is meant to dissociate her from it, but the writing of the game, at least in the localization, obfuscates the reality that they're different people. Thus, some have explicitly claimed in the fandom that it was ridiculous for Futaba to antagonize the thieves twice and then make a big deal out of disarming her own hacktivist group, when that is in no way, shape, or form what actually happened. Hell, we meet the shadow of the IT president who was the Medjed antagonizing us later when we actually assault the head of the conspiracy. Two completely different people are involved in this, and one is needed to counter the malice of the other. Now, this will be one of the few times I will in any way praise the garbage adaptation that is Persona 5 the animation, and actually doing a lot to clarify this point. Showing on screen in shadow that specific IT head acting as Medjed during the anime's adaptation of this arc, acting as counterpoint to Futaba's own setup in them doing this. Which makes sense as this man is her personal long-form antagonist. Not in the sense that he is the cause of her suffering. Oh no, that's the two that caused her mother's death, forged a suicide note, and planted the palace that's tormented her in her head. But that IT head is the one who hacked Wakaba's computer, stole her research for the conspiracy, and wiped all evidence of it existing, which caused Futaba's extended family to abuse her in consequence. All for him to be rewarded with the position he now holds at his company and his status as confidant in the conspiracy. He is the one Futaba has been trying to find to prove her mother didn't kill herself and was murdered. And like the others, he is taunting her by dangling exactly what she's after in front of her face, and using the identity she created in order to do it. Now, initially the thieves write off both of these hackers of being any concern. Because they operate in the metaverse, there's little tangible evidence they leave behind by which for a hacker to track them down in the real world. The problem, of course, being the conspiracy through the Black Masked Assassin already knows who they are. And because Persona users don't have a shadow that lives in the metaverse, they cannot just kill them with a mental shutdown, thus is trying to dispose of them through other means, or spook them enough so they will not interfere with their grand scheme, due to them already destroying 3 of the palaces and means of control they put in place, which disrupts all their other operations to cause civil unrest through the psychological breakdowns and other destroyed individuals like we've been seeing and correcting already throughout the game. What changes things, however, is the man using the Medjed name, escalating things and hacking broadcasts to threaten the country that if the thieves do not turn themselves in, they'll launch a mass hacking attack that will crash Japan's economy. Thus, they need Futaba's help to prevent that due to all the people that will harm. And the entire thing is itself a ploy by the conspiracy to force the thieves to act. Of course, they were never going to crash the economy, as that would then cause so much chaos they'd never be able to control the uproar. It was merely a false flag operation to try and get them what they wanted, any form of response at all. And also, to distract them from their real goal. But even getting to the point of reaching Futaba's palace so she will help them is an uphill battle, simply due to all the defenses Futaba has put up to isolate herself from anyone that could harm her. Thus, even as she in her own way is begging for help, she's too terrified to even reach out and take that first step, which she needs to do in order to finally get better. And throughout all of this, again as I'm using the Japanese audio track, voice actress Aoi Yuki is absolutely nailing every element of this portrayal, some of this carrying over from the demands of her prior roles. In particular, Madoka Kaname from Madoka Magica, but especially the moments flashing back to the emotional devastation simmering under the surface of Hibiki Tachibana in Symphogear. It actively shows her range and contrast against the more chipper and upbeat characters she tends to play, but also often don't show themselves as the most intelligent. Whereas Futaba? Yeah, she's a super genius with a mischievous snarky streak that just isn't allowed to show itself until after we help heal her heart and mind. But this is where I feel the English dub of the game was the most poorly handled, due to Erika Lindbeck just not portraying these aspects of the character when she voiced the role, taking the deadpan of the deadpan snarker and making it ring throughout her performances as the most prevalent trait. Again, I feel this is as much a directorial problem as anything, but the nuance, the vocal tics, the warble of Futaba's voice when she's affected by the palace and the moments of aggression when people mess with her things, it's all just too divergent from the basis for the character Aoi provides to call it a good performance by comparison. However, as opposed to when I brought up such with the divergent portrayal for Ryuji and Makoto, where I feel the English dub undermined the characterization, but I do not consider such intentional, this matter with respect to Futaba has only been further muddied by Erika's own statements about why her performance is this way, as she came to be of the personal opinion that Futaba was autistic, and she believed her portrayal acted to reflect the mannerisms of someone with autism. And I am not the right person to speak on matters of autism spectrum disorders. So, I looked up a swarm of medical papers on the matter to try and give myself some level of education, and consulted actual autistic individuals for this next section. But at the end of the day, I just kept feeling unqualified to speak on the matter as I myself am not on the autistic spectrum. I have family that does, friends that do, my roommates are, and seen the various ways theirs have manifested which they live with, so I do have personal experience with those on the spectrum. But that still doesn't give me standing to be any authority on it, which is best left to those who are. There's your disclaimer warning for this entire next section. And hey, a lot of people aren't qualified to do so, as autism can be expressed differently, so one's singular experience is not representative of everyone who has it. The reality is the condition can vary wildly, so what is an expression of it in some is not necessarily that for others. And not helped by when various individuals learned about it either, as what the definition of and what constituted autism has changed a lot over the past 20 years. So the definition that people my age and older may have been taught is completely invalid now, which is part of what makes the assertion problematic. Different people have different takes on it that don't necessarily reflect what autism actually is, and base it more on personality traits and quirks instead of on behaviors and the ways in which individuals process information. And not helped either by works of fiction literally writing characters to bear certain traits, so authorial intent and the context of the story in which they're included beyond just the characters themselves is also a factor in such considerations. And fictional characters who are not implicitly defined by their creators consequently cannot be diagnosed by a medical professional to determine whether one definitively is or is not because of their very nature as fictional characters. And even deliberate attempts at portraying someone like that can sometimes fall short of what was needed to be depicted because it can end up treated as a character trait and not founded on one's behaviors. Or those behaviors themselves are indicative of a different medical or psychological condition that itself may have nothing to do with autism. Or, at absolute worst, it can be caused to justify indefensible behaviors by or to a given character, which we do not accept. Now, fortunately, I can sidestep the majority of this matter that I am unqualified to speak on by bringing up how this perception is the consequence of details made absent in localization, which explicitly said what Futaba is suffering from, which ended up in conflict with Erika's assertion. Yes, again, and I am serious about this and intending to present this in good faith, and ran this by actual ASD individuals. For you see, the reason I keep giving the localization flack is in its unnecessary changes, it keeps omitting or altering essential need-to-know information required to depict the story and characters correctly, which you only start to see when you play the game with the Japanese audio. And that is something localizations are not supposed to do if you want to be considered a good one. Again, we don't go off on rephrasing something so it flows better in English but means the same thing. We have hostility to words when the content gets misrepresented because of a loss of context when the original script gets disregarded instead of rephrased. And the context lost this time actually pertains to the true name of the conspiracy that is the antagonist of the Persona 5 games and how their actions affected their victims. That name being the Antisocial Force. This name was never included in any English media. Admittedly, the title for them was not used inside of the game's storyline themselves until Persona 5 Strikers, but it was used in supplementary material outside of the games before that point. And yet, that name still didn't make it into the English version of Strikers either, as the dialogue that gave the group that name was entirely cut from the localization. So yes, it is still valid to say this was a mistake on the localization's part, as they deliberately acted to omit it. And this is relevant to this specific discussion because of why they are named that. The Antisocial Force was given that title because of the specific actions their metaverse agent took to change the cognition of their victims, and the victims of those victims. At least when they didn't just kill the shadow to cause a mental shutdown. Regardless of whether such resulted in a psychotic breakdown or the formation of a palace, or they became hosts to a distortion as a result of exposure to a palace, they are the result of them being infected by a condition which manifests as an antisocial personality disorder in order to benefit the heads and backers of this conspiracy. And antisocial personality disorders are not the same thing as autism spectrum disorders. Their diagnosis is similar, and it is based from behaviors, not personality traits, but autism is a developmental issue, representing someone having difficulties throughout their lives processing differing forms of information and the learning that would result. Whereas antisocial issues are consequences of experiences and trauma, or a deliberate self-deceptive choice made that the perpetrator is deluded into thinking they have the self-aggrandizing, self-righteous authority to do whatever they want with impunity. This is not something they have throughout their lives or is a consequence of their development, but it's more of a mental block which results in similar difficulties as those on the spectrum, but possesses an external trigger or level of irrationality for why such begins. And treating antisocial issues the same as one would autism can end up being offensive towards those in either grouping as it misrepresents what their actual conditions are. Which is actually why I felt like I could talk about this, as I have some antisocial problems, my social anxiety being the biggest one of them. And they're treated in entirely separate ways from how one would manage autism. But the confusion over the two is responsible for a large amount of the misconceptions that revolve around the other, resulting in why the diagnosis and definitions were divorced from one another 20 years ago. And yet the errors about them continue. Hell, there's this whole controversy in Japan over the term jiheisho, which literally translates as social withdrawal condition, and it being used improperly to describe, diagnose, and being improperly translated as autism, and that creating such negative cultural stigma towards actually autistic individuals that it took a manga called With the Light to demystify and divorce the actual disorder from antisocial issues. The book succeeded so well in the 2000s, it's actually what got the medical definition of jiheisho changed to prevent this from reoccurring. This whole incident catching on internationally and leading to ASD becoming the popular name for the diagnosis. Only for Japanese to English translators not to get the memo about jiheisho, as they sometimes still use it, which continues to make understanding this harder. Admittedly, those originally diagnosed as such still use the term, but because the two groupings of conditions are no longer associated with one another, it has led to better recognition of symptoms and treatments and reduced stigmatization of such. It's just idiots that keep treating them as the same. Another such misconception being that autism is in any way a curable disease, because an antisocial behavior that is similar to autism can be treated, when that is not the case. Antisocial issues are sometimes curable and correctable, as they have an external cause, some experience they had which triggered their responses. Thus why, in this consideration about Futaba, she more leans towards having such, as we do correct most of her trauma-born ones over the course of both her chapter of the game and her Confidant Arc, so she can be a functional person in society again. With the remainder of her quirks and neuroses that get cited consequential of personality traits, not necessarily behaviorally born ones. As otherwise, well, to characterize Futaba's problems and even Palace as consequences of her bearing autism, as Erica claims her story is allegorical to or representative of, well, on top of just ignoring the literal text of the game and it saying what the problem is, that being her being traumatized by being a witness to her mother's death, and then abused by her family members before her Palace fully kicked in, Then you have the knock-on effect when looked at macroscopically to the rest of the game beyond just her, and the game making it explicit later that all of these incidents with palace formations are all ones the victims are infected by, when autism is not a disease, and by us stealing the heart of the distortion to destroy them and correct the aberrant behavioral issues, it by this allegory thus claims that there is a cure to a developmental issue, which has long been asserted by autism advocates far more educated on the matter than myself, that such is an offensive context to put such in.
Okay, but that's worse. I mean, you do get how that's worse, right?
Now, I don't know Erica Lindbeck myself, so I have no reason to believe she has made such proclamations maliciously to cover for the weaknesses in her portrayal, or advocating her views on the character she plays in anything other than good faith. But the game series makes clear that the distortions we are dealing with are all manifestations of antisocial issues. Or at least, it did originally, which the localization did not properly reflect. As I started with on this, she may have very well been operating, as many people do, on an outdated perception of what autism is when divorced from antisocial personality disorders. All I can say to hopefully conclude this several minutes of awkwardness is, 1. The group Autism Speaks is a hate group that cons the unknowing into having claims of legitimacy, does not help actual autistic individuals, and continues to spread false information about the disorder to further stigmatize it to the masses, so do not trust any information you may get from that group. And 2. There's actually a better candidate than Futaba among the cast for someone that may potentially be on the autism spectrum to add that representation if one so desires. Yusuke. Well, once more, I am not a proper authority on the matter and believe that proper claims to such should be left to a doctor's diagnosis. I say this because throughout his events in the game, Yusuke exhibits signs of bearing problems with object permanence. The understanding that an object only functions as an object in a specifically given form. My stepbrother possesses autism and struggled with object permanence the most out of his respective symptoms as a child, resulting in him smashing all of his and my toys that I kept at my dad's place until the point I only ever left Legos there so he couldn't destroy anything irreparably. And one of the things Yusuke does in Persona 5 is mangle Futaba's Featherman figures into, well, this. As this and some of Yusuke's other acts are things my stepbrother did that was claimed to be a consequence of his autism, that is a sign to me that Yusuke may have such, which does not conflict with the palace stuff like it does Futaba, or act as consequence of Madarame's raising of Yusuke to explain away such oddities, as Madarame only became overtly abusive in the last couple years when he was infected with his palace, thus lacked active malice during Yusuke's key developmental years to be responsible for all of these oddities. I certainly consider it a valid possibility with him. Though even then, with Erika's viewpoint of Futaba, when just considering solely Erika's performance, well, regardless of justification, it's hard to think of it as a good one. Every individual I know who is on the autistic spectrum is more emotive in their respective tones of voice than Erika portrayed in her voice for Futaba, where even when her voice was raised to yell, it felt either flat or out of tone with the situation. I feel like I inflect and emote more than she did in this role. So once again, I find her doing better work elsewhere than she did here and in the other Persona 5 related media. I really only wanted to critique her performance and have that be the end of it, since it is just so different to Aoyuki's and not in ways I found positive. But if I didn't bring this all up, I was certain the comments would just swarm me over this. But as a consequence of the portrayal being so off the mark, even before Erika made her opinions about her views on the character clear, unfortunately the toxic side of Persona's fandom took away from this that Futaba's just being a selfish brat and utterly ignore the actual psychological damage that has to be addressed, which is as far as you can get from what her portrayal was supposed to be. If you want an actual bitchy, bratty character from Aoyuki, well, that would be Tatsumaki the Tornado of Terror. Or if you want the sadistic sociopath, that'd be Tanya von Dergachaff. Aoyuki's developed an excessively diverse list of characters over the last decade. Very impressive for a woman who started her acting career as a victim of the weak in Gingaman. And all thanks to the immense vocal versatility she's showcased in how she does emote with her roles.
お祭りデート してもらっちゃいいわよね。時間かけて夏祭りを楽しみましょう。あ、もちろん。ふたりきりでね。
And thus we get to her palace, which is one gigantic tomb out deep in a desert of nothing, and representative of how deeply she has chosen to isolate herself. And because Futaba's shadow isn't the ruler, it actively helps us through the winding maze her mind has become to disable the traps, and lead us to the decaying relics. Us literally having to piece back together the murals of Futaba's distorted consciousness to reaffirm what she believes to be true, and undo the lies the distortion has forced upon her. It actually taking until the actual distortion infesting her mind notices we're trying to fix it, and hijacks her shadow for the group to actually enter their Phantom Thief forms, since those only manifest in the metaverse when we are recognized as an enemy of a palace ruler. And Shadow Futaba herself recognizes us only as friends and allies when she's not forced to obey the whims of the unnatural invasive distortion. This is part of why, at least to me, this makes Futaba's phallus appropriately one of the more difficult to traverse, as it's not down to game mechanics trying to screw us over. It is for more important thematic reasons, as not only is Futaba's psyche trying to actively protect itself, the threat to her psyche, i.e. the distortion that even manifests the palace, is still trying to infect and destroy her, and she's been fighting it off all this time. But she's losing. That's why her mind more and more resembles a rotting tomb. This is plainly obvious, except to apparently the Phantom Thieves themselves, who just proceed to blame Ryuji anytime he voices his frustrations with this palace on behalf of the audience. For suddenly out of nowhere it gets harder as them talking draws the attention of the actual incarnation of wrath in this realm. I did not exaggerate when I said this game wrongfully makes Ryuji the butt monkey throughout it. I was sick of it before we even completed Kamoshida's palace, and is beyond unwelcome here. Especially, again, as we have worse offenders in the fucking cast.
今はやめといた方がいいんじゃね。昔ひでえ目にあったっぽいし。
そうね。死ぬなんて言ってたし。
待って。双葉ちゃん、お母さんは本当にあなたが殺したの？あんたの口から本当のことが聞きたい。
バカ、お前。
The challenge of the tomb does have some benefits, as it encourages regularly swapping party members and persona to get one's best advantages of the things down here, and consequently work on learning new game mechanics. Specifically...
Showtime.
Showtimes are new additions to Royal unlocked from our contact and interactions with Jose in the metaverse, giving us a Lucky Star key item, which grants us their powers. Such being cutaway team non-sequitur attacks used by two members of the Thieves that can deal as much damage as an all-out attack, them only requiring one of the members of it be on the field, with by the end of the game you unlocking a total of 8 of them. I kinda wish they'd made more so everyone could have a proper team-up attack, but I get it being hard to have a coherent theme to them. The Showtimes have numerous trigger conditions, being a baton pass, loss of health, a critical injury, or even potentially a status ailment. It doesn't matter either which side of the fight these occur on. Either can trigger such events, as long as you've unlocked them, so you see them more frequently as the game moves on. At the time we're hunting through Futaba's tomb, though, we've got access to 3, Morgana and Ann's, Ryuji and Yusuke's, and Makoto and Ryuji's. And it's a nice reward when we do get the chance to trigger them. Unfortunately, the last defense of Futaba's palace is one we can't break through, as it's based around that same cognitive lock that Madarame had, of a domain to them so absolute they control all entry, meaning we have to convince Futaba to open the door herself, for us to be able to save her. Even her shadow getting in on this, using the palace's own forced upon hallucinations to force her to accept their outstretched hand. and stop hiding in both the metaphorical and literal closet. Alas, Symphogear XV was a few years away from debuting, so Hibiki hadn't yet had the opportunity to confess to Miku yet. What, I'm behind on making deliberate actor illusion jokes. She is such a dork. I cannot believe people hate on this shut-in tech gremlin. From this, though, and knowing that door was the final barrier, they give her the triggering calling card to manifest her distortion.
Sakura Futaba wa taizai o okashita. Yotte wareware ga sono yuganda yokubou o nekosogi ubai toru.
Yeah, this is another point where I have to call out the localization again, as this is a big, big fuck-up. As if you paid attention to the line, Taizai Okashita translates as Great Sin, but the calling card does not specifically state what that sin was. That line of sloth was added by the translators, and it is completely wrong. This is a perfect textbook example of an unnecessary localization change that does nothing but damage one's understanding of the underlying story, and that shit needs to stop. As there is a completely different character and antagonist in this that represents the sin of sloth. Futaba's is wrath. Though as we get back inside the palace and reach the treasure chamber, we learn that the distortion this time is not the treasure. It is instead the monster that has been tormenting Futaba, and why she needs to bear that specific sin. For the true ruler of the Palace of Wrath has manifested itself in the form of a vengeful Wakaba Ishiki. Unfortunately, we can't do a damn thing to it due to its continued free manipulation of the palace. Only one person can truly confront this sin within Futaba. And fortunately, as said before, the MetaNav app spreads like a virus. Futaba having obtained it earlier, and learned from her observations how to use it, entering her own palace and finding her shadow, who walks her through the events of her mother's death again, but reminding her of what she had missed in her shock, the thing the distortion had been trying to bury, but Futaba's shadow had desperately clung onto in order to resist the distortion's possession, and that being nothing more than the truth she knew inside all along.
お母さん、こう言った。もうすぐ研究が終わる。終わったら、双葉の好きなところに連れて行くわ。双葉、ずっと一人にさせてごめんね。でも、本当に大事な研究だから、分かって。命をかけて研究を完成させなければいけないの。お前は嫌われていたのか。違う。桜双葉、思い出せ。自殺したのはお前のせい。研究を邪魔したから。なぜ自殺だと思った。遺書。そうだ。黒い服の大人に見せられた遺書だ。何が書いてあった。私への恨み。お前は辛くてショックで目をそらした。だが黒い服の大人は永遠と読み上げた。大勢の親戚の前で。よく考えろ。あの遺書は本物か。本当に大好きだったお母さんが書いたのか。あんなひどいこと一度でも言われたか。ない。私がわがまま言った時は怒られたけど優しかった。ならばあの遺書は真っ赤な偽物だ。お前は利用されたんだ。遺書を捏造し死をなすりつけ幼い心を傷つけ踏みにじった。怒れ。クズみたいな大人を許すな。私が 自分自身とお母さんの死とちゃんと向き合わなかったせい。なんで私あんなこと言われなきゃならなかったの？お前を否定する者は幻影。心なき者どもが施した呪い。もとよりお前は知っていた。そう、知ってた。でも私、
お前のせいで私は今度お前のせいだ。全部
私はもう歪んだ上っ面なんかには騙されない。他人の声にも惑わされない。自分の目と心を信じて真実を見抜く。お前なんてお母さんのわけない。腐った大人が作った偽物だ。絶対に許すもんか。何あれ。契約。我は汝、汝は我。禁断の英知を開かれた。いかなる謎の幻ももはやお前を惑わせない。歌は大丈夫。おりゃ、お願い手伝って。あいつやっつける。
Now, let's crush that catbird. As a Persona user, Futaba becomes the team's active metaverse navigator. Her nickname and thief alias supposed to originally be Navi, but that was changed to Oracle in the English localization. Why? I have no idea, as it's not like Nintendo trademarked the name Navi for the Legend of Zelda character. I'd be surprised DC didn't sue them for it, though, as Oracle was Barbara Gordon's alias for a couple decades when she wasn't Batgirl. Though following the New 52 reboot, Barbara went back to being Batgirl and stopped using it, so it was free at the time this game was being imported. But sans an actual reason for the change, it does come off as yet another unnecessary localization change, as nothing acknowledges it in the actual Persona material beyond when they're changing the name. But her Persona Necronomicon allows her limited hacking of the metaverse, in part thanks to her subconscious awareness and retention of her mother's research, alongside her own skills as a hacker, which in normal battle allows us to have special advantages on occasion, and in this incident bringing down the Spectre of Wrath's flight-generated invulnerability by activating the trap card Ballista Squad! What, Aoyuki sung one of the themes to Yu-Gi-Oh! Zell. This is a legit reference. Look, you may be a giant sphinx with the head of our newest companion's mom, but I got the power of God and anime, and this gun I found on my side. With this, Futaba's proper cognition is restored, her true memories of her mother re-emerging, so she can gain the resolve to move on, and properly say goodbye. After which her palace collapses, with the distortion outright destroyed by the team this time. The treasure retrieved from the palace being Futaba herself. Well, that and Persona users cannot have palaces due to it being impossible to distort perception of themselves after their awakening. Thus, a Persona user awakening inside their own palace, yeah, that just accelerates the process of collapse with the distortion gone. Now, this entire chapter of the game has been accused of being just the Persona developers ripping themselves off with respect to how they handled the dungeons and character arcs of Persona 4, wherein to recruit a party member they'd have to confront the truths of themselves amidst having a fight with their own rampaging shadow. And while there are similarities, I can't really agree that it is the same. After all, we're not fighting Futaba's shadow in this entire thing. Her shadow is helping us destroy the distortion, killing Futaba. Nor is her shadow the cause of the palace's manifestation. Hell, the dungeons in Persona 4 weren't even created by those shadows either. They were created by the collective consciousness of the people of Inaba whenever some individual in the town would get stuck in their head, and their shadow would take up residence there after being driven insane by the Sagiri's fog into embracing self-deception, where a trait an individual doesn't like about themselves is trying to obfuscate the whole, which caused deliberate rejection between person and their shadow. Whereas here, Futaba's shadow has been enduring all this time to help cure their true self, not supersede it. I think people who claim Futaba's palace is like Persona 4's dungeons just saw the similarity and assumed it meant that it was all the same in execution, when that could not have been more different. It is a common problem in literary analysis that some just don't know where the line between the two is. But as a consequence of this, as well as Futaba's physical frailty from her lack of physical activity for years, she is not capable of being a frontline fighter. Which is fine. We've got enough of those for the most part, and needed someone hanging back analyzing means by which to weaken the enemy and strengthen our party, or manipulate the metaverse to our advantage, which are all things Futaba can do. At least after she wakes up. As part of the consequence of Futaba's hypertension over her trauma, is she could spend multiple days awake without rest, with her just trying to occupy her mind so she wouldn't think about what tormented her, that only having gotten worse with the recent palace-caused hallucinations. Fortunately, Tai's around to check her out, Sojiro likewise confirming the diagnosis that it's just exhaustion. Futaba tending to sleep for a few days straight when her body can't stand anymore, as fatigue sleeps are often dream and nightmare-free. But come on, it's just July 27th when I complete this. How long can she sleep for? Yeah, Futaba does not wake up until August 21st, nearly a month later. And with the summer schedule opening up a third time slot of usable event time, the idea is you do Futaba's Palace the first chance you can, then free up the rest of your time in the summer to just rail through completing as many of the Confidants as you plausibly can.
Nurui. こんなの売り物になんない。
そんなことよりお前どうやってここまで
歩いてきた。
平気なのか。
ダメか。
そうじゃねえだろ。お前が家の外に出るなんて。
心配かけた。
そうか。そうか。
Fortunately, Futaba wakes up with plenty of time to break the fake Medjed's hold, crashing her and her companion's former website so the conspiracy can't use it against us. With this consequently earning us our hacker gremlin ginger companion. At least, once we get her acclimated to being around us some more due to her complete lack of social skills. To be fair, I would have that exact same response if someone messed with my Gunpla. Besides that, again, at the time, Futaba through Actor Illusion did have a stronger connection to a Super Sentai spoof, thanks to Super Sentai being how Aoi Yuki debuted as an actor.
動くなこいつの命はないぜやめろ人質はお前のお得意だなブルブラック銀河マン剣を捨てろ
I will never get tired of showing people that clip. So yeah, all we end up spending the remainder of summer doing is getting Futaba acclimated to being outside again. now that the planted distortion is no longer making her hide away from the world. But years of being a world-fearing shut-in, that's not something you fix in a day, or even a week, even when they are in a more mentally healthy state. For someone who felt like they had to live as a shut-in, there's always the opportunity for a relapse, when their social anxiety completely overwhelms them. And I speak from experience on that. I've mentioned in the past that I get so freaked out over public speaking that I have blacked out when just giving presentations in a classroom setting. Not being able to see an audience has actually helped me, and it's in part of doing the show that I've gotten just the slightest bit better that I don't freak out in doing it. But I have still hyperventilated at work when talking to a group of managers when I brought a collection of safety issues to their attention. Not a single one of them that has gotten fixed as of this recording, but that's on them at this point as they were warned. Sojiro, for his part, is beyond grateful to Ren for doing so, as now that she's shown tangible recovery, even if Sai makes good on her threats, they have evidence thanks to Futaba's mental state improving that her being with him is the best thing for her. Especially since, through even just a full week of interacting with the group, she's comfortable enough with them to be able to travel out and about alongside them, and once more, just be a normal girl.
我は汝、汝は我。汝、ここに新たなる契りを得たり。契りはすなわち、囚われを破らんとする反逆の翼なり。我、法王のペルソナの生誕に祝福の風を得たり。自由へと至るさらなる力とならん。
Like Ryotaro, Nanako, Dojima, and Persona 4, Sojiro and Futaba's confidants are eternally intertwined. While Sojiro's is one of those that unlocks earlier in the game, permitting the protagonist to make coffee and curry in the cafe from Sojiro's recipes, it will not advance past a certain point until after Futaba's chapter and palace have been completed. Which makes sense, due to Sojiro's role as just being the den father of this group as the only responsible adult in the group's lives. Thematically, this makes Sojiro to be the Reuben Ashford of the story for the Code Geass parallel. Reuben being the man who took Lelouch and Nunnally in after they survived their family trying to kill them amidst the invasion of Japan, and sheltered them from their enemies. Sadly, the character makes near zero appearances in the main story, but was lore important, meaning this was once more a parallel that's more narrative-based than anything. In reality, Sojiro more resembles a retired Daisuke Jigen with his appearance and preferred style, as well as his backstory of him being involved in government matters before he retired to take care of Futaba. Though him being a caring and responsible father is itself a role subversion for his Japanese actor, as well as English actor Jameson Price has portrayed his own share of those who seek to nurture youths to become their best selves. Well, Joji Nakata not so much. As well, he's had a number of roles. There is a specific set of people who will always remember him as the Great Professor Bias, the central villain of Choju Sentai Live Man, one of the best Super Sentai series ever made.
Tomoyo, 君たちはなぜ悪魔に魂を売ったのか?
Where the devil in question, Professor Bias, was a man who was cheating death through a means of mind over matter, him indoctrinating and manipulating genius students with his teachings, and turning them evil until they would become intelligent enough for him to harvest their brains, which would continue to grant him eternal life. And ever since that role, Nakata has repeatedly played either supremely evil scientists like Albert Wesker in the Resident Evil franchise, manipulators of children like Kirei Kotomine in the Fate franchise, or just those who have such a magnanimous agenda that they care not who they harm, such as Master Megatron in Transformers Galaxy Force, or more relevantly, Diehard Reed in Code Geass. I did say several of these actors in Japanese have worked together in the past. But this is how that role subversion works. As well, he doesn't always play villains. it is far more rare for Joji Nakata to play as good a man as Sojiro is, as Sojiro, in his protection and nurturing of Futaba, fully acts in defiance of Nakata's most definitive roles. This ends up matching, as a result, the upward-oriented Heirophant Arcana, which represents marriage, mercy, and general goodness. And since that tarot continues to be used for parents in this series, the difficulties of them being a good parent. Whereas the reversed Hierophant represents prioritization of society over responsibilities, and just overall weakness of an individual. As one could say a few things about Sojiro, but weakness isn't one of them. Without every time someone tries to act aggressively towards them, he does push back, because he has something to fight for in his own way. As the deeper you dive into the Confidant, you learn, or rather come to realize, why Sojiro was always being called away from the shop. And such had to do with Futaba, and Futaba's relatives attempting to further extort money out of him. Much like with the Nijima sisters and their father's funds, whatever resources and savings Wakaba might have had were never provided to her, or rather was most likely taken and spent by her guardians. Sojiro paying them off to get Futaba and making them think that Sojiro himself has a secret account or something. But the reality is, all he has is his home, this shop, and Futaba. At this point, that's all he wants and needs. Hell, if you do Sojiro's rank 3 in early June, then in the middle of June amidst the Kaneshiro arc, when everyone is having money troubles, Sojiro himself is complaining about being short on cash himself, implying he's paying off Futaba's relatives to keep her safe amidst all of this. All of this comes to a head when the back half of Sojiro's Confidant opens up after Futaba's distortion is destroyed. As well, much of it reveals how much of a good parent Sojiro is endeavoring to be amidst mourning Wakaba. He in fact got his curry recipe from her. It allows Futaba to see how much he sacrificed for her now that her eyes are more open, ultimately bringing her on request to change her relatives' hearts, just between the two of them, to prevent her relatives from filing a report with child welfare. We failed to get to them before they file it, but because it was all done as extortion in their own history of actual child abuse towards Futaba, they had to file it anonymously, making it so the welfare workers that aren't overworked have to come by and get the details of the situation more thoroughly, and see Futaba's actual progress in recovering, to show to even them that her place, at least until she's a legal adult, is with Sojiro and Ren.
火災から電話が来てな、双葉のおじが訴えを取り下げたらしい。お前なんだろ。あいつもいつか嫁に行く日が来んのかね。あいつ将来絶対いい女になるぞ。なんてったって若葉の娘だからな。たく、娘を持つ父親ってな、こんな気苦労してんのかよ。店を手伝わせるだけのつもりがよ、守るべき家族があったことまで気づかせてくれやがった。双葉とそれとお前な、頼りになんねえかもしれねえけど、何かあったら遠慮せずに言えよ。そん時はお前の力になる、家族として。あとはそうだな、俺の教えられること全部教えてやる。もうお前は一人前だ。まだまだ恩を返すには足りねえが、俺にできんのはそんくらいだ。
我は汝、汝は我。汝ここにちぎりを血明の絆へと転生せしめたり、絆は反逆の翼となりて魂のくびきを打ち破らん。今こそ汝、法皇の究極なる非王に目覚めたり、無尽の力を汝に与えん。
あとは言っとくが、双葉とそんなんとかできれば勘弁してくれな。
About that.
我は汝、汝は我。汝、ここに新たなるちぎりを得たり。ちぎりはすなわち、 囚われを破らんとする反逆の翼なり。我忍者のペルソナの生誕に祝福の風を得たり、自由へと至るさらなる力とならん。
Futaba's counterpart, Confidant, is about her continuing her mental and emotional recovery. Remembering and taking advantage of old tricks her mother helped her create to set achievable goals for herself in becoming more comfortable with the outside world and any strangers she may encounter, as when she's alone and surrounded by too many people, she ends up freaking out again. She asks Ren to accompany her in each of these jaunts as her key item, because of course as a shut-in, Futaba's been an avid gamer, though again as a likely distraction from the palace-caused hallucinations. But just because a hobby is a distraction doesn't mean that it's unhealthy. It's just how one copes. But coping isn't always synonymous with getting better, which is what Futaba is resolved to achieve, as she owes that to her mother's memory, and Sojiro as well, that she be able to function on her own again, even if she ends up becoming overly attached to Ren in the process to obfuscate from attention on her. This isn't unsurprising due to her arcana, the Hermit, being about one being wary of the world and hiding from it, usually in part of their own healing and recovery. It's basically the tarot card representing introverted individuals who act at odds to a cohesive society, retreating from it for introspection and the gathering of wisdom and strength. Reverse, the arcana represents deliberate hiding out of fear and unreasonable caution, attacking those who get close to them. And that's a state Futaba was forced into thanks to her palace, which we only just saved her from. And knowing of that experience personally, she now seeks to help others out of it, even if she's still recovering herself. For as part of her Confidant story, she tries to reconnect to other friends she had before her mom's death, and make up for lost time. Her even taking out another metaverse case when the lost friend, Kana, she finds to have been taken out of school herself and forced to work as a fetish model by her parents in order to help in paying off their gambling addiction. Kana even having made a request on the Phantom Aficionado's website begging for help, which she asks they put as a high priority. It reminds Futaba of how Sojiro saved her from a similar scumbag, and wants to intervene for her friend. As the falsehood forced upon her, her lost friend had lived in reality, and Futaba has the power to do something about it. Which is what informs her own Code Geass parallel in this. For whether you end up viewing her as a paramour or not, Futaba acts as the little sister character of the story, and thus the equivalent to Nunnally v. Britannia narratively, albeit with her technical genius and agoraphobia being better justified versions of the traits of Nina Einstein. Which is again where I roll my eyes at the toxic fans who hate on Futaba for being a drama queen bratty little sister, if not for the autism allegations, when she was meant to be the little sister role in the first place and have explicable trauma whose effects linger and inform her personality. Maybe it's her sudden shift into being a snarky individual after the palace is banished, but some of the best snark comes from those who are themselves jaded or are just so tired and done with the world that they don't care enough to have a filter over their words and attitude. And that is again how Futaba comes off to me, especially since she spent several years with no social interaction beyond those online, so her social filters are basically non-existent. She thinks it, she bluntly says it. And then honestly, once you get used to it, is endearing since, well, who else is going to bust your balls in the same way as a little sister type? But it's in how Futaba bonds with Ren that then potentially escalates her to paramour status for some. As after you recruit her, she's basically attached to your hip outside of class, and enabling in the best ways all the Phantom Thieves schemes. And she has a real strong dynamic with Makoto as well in this group as the team's responsible big sister. Thus, if the harem scenario wasn't a trap, I think they could potentially work something out between them. As Futaba in reality is only a year younger than Ren is. She just looks far younger than that due to lack of exercise and not eating right. With such being fixed though, who knows how that might go. But regardless if you paramour her or not, Futaba's got Ren's back. And there's no way such a direct victim of the conspiracy would ever consider helping them willingly.
見慣れた部屋のはずなのに、今までと違って見える。ここだけじゃない。世界がね、どんどん広がっていくの。毎日いろんな発見がある。私、一番最初からすっごい大きなものもらってるんだよ。命をもらった。ありのままでいいって教えられたし、お母さんを信じろって教えられた。死んでた私が生き返った。だから私、怪盗団で恩返ししたい。っていうか、私変わったの。見つけちゃったの。もう自分のためじゃ一番の力が出ない。仲間のため、ジョーカーのためって思うと、知らなかった力が溢れてくるの。我は汝、汝は我。汝ここにちぎりを血明の絆へと転生せしめたり。絆は反逆の翼となりて、魂のくびきを打ち破らん。今こそ汝、忍者の究極なる疲労に目覚めたり。無尽の力を汝に与えん。やべえ、心がバージョンアップ。新しい私、爆弾。
よし。
But while we've been busy helping Futaba, neither the conspiracy nor the government have been idle. The government is not happy about being humiliated in this exchange at all by their complete helplessness. The threat of the crashing economy being capitalized by a politician named Shido, who happens to be the head of the conspiracy and the man who framed Ren, to call the current administration incompetent, and advocate for a dissolution of political parties to all come together to obey the whims of just one man who will direct the course of the nation. Yeah, anytime that's happened in the course of history, that ends up being a really, really bad thing. Especially as he orchestrated this entire scheme to create a big enough scandal to leverage his political candidacy, all revolving around a cry of locking them up. Again, this game occurs in 2016. So again, this entire part of the story was a false flag operation. We saved Futaba, but the conspiracy still got what they wanted out of it. Worse, the public believing that the Phantom Thieves took down and stopped the fake Medjed has done nothing but piss Sai off. Akechi empathizing with how they seem to keep getting away and escaping, beginning to suggest to Sai that they may be behind something bigger, a greater manipulation of everything taking place, and towards a far larger target.
こんなの僕の正義が許さない。
はい、メジェードの件予想以上に効果があったようで、これで怪盗団の指示も一層拍車がかかるでしょうな。そうですね、怪盗団を効果的に使う手だってはありますし、不要なゴミは今のうちに処分を、たとえ身内だろうとね。
じゃあ次の犯行の話に移るわ。当然知っているわね。何しろこの男は、この件に関する証言は重いわよ。理由はわかるわね。心して答えなさい。君たちはこの奥村に何をしたの？